Hey everybody, the focus of this lesson is the market revolution, and it's based on the key concept 4.2, which is about how the innovations just essentially led to profound changes to U.S. society, the economy, and so forth. Our first objective is to discuss the new transportation systems and technologies that dramatically expanded manufacturing and agricultural production. And I want to start first with some demographic changes that occurred. Number one, population growth was just astronomical in the United States during this time. In 1789, there were 13 states. By 1860, there were 33. The U.S. population was doubling almost every 25 years. Natural birth rate accounted for a huge part of that increase, but also immigration added hundreds of thousands more per year. In 1820, less than 1% of U.S. population was foreign-born, yet by 1860, about 13% were foreign-born. And we were the fourth most populous Western country by 1860, behind Russia, France, and the Austrian Empire. Also by 1860, 43 U.S. cities had above 20,000 people. And we'll talk about urbanization as we go through. So this map just shows some of the major city centers in 1790: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Charleston, and the settlement patterns mostly west of the Appalachians. This next one shows, in 1820, shows those same cities plus the growth of New Orleans and increased population patterns in the west. Notice along the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley, the increase in population, which led to this cash crop agriculture and better farming. And finally, by the outbreak of the Civil War, we see much of the East already settled on both sides of the Mississippi, plus several other larger cities, including Atlanta, Raleigh, Richmond, Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, and Buffalo, New York. And lastly, regarding population growth, I just wanted to show this graph of it as well, showing a total population of 4 million in 1790. And if you go through and take a look, by 1860, 31 million, over 31 million as well. And of course, including slaves, Indians, and European immigrants. And you can see the difference between the white and the non-white population as well. Moving on to the market revolution, this is such a broad term to be discussed. And as we start out, it just encompassed several areas. First off, there was the Industrial Revolution, what we call the first Industrial Revolution occurring. The Transportation Revolution, changes in the building of turnpikes and canals and so forth. The transition to large-scale cash crop farming, especially in the Northwest, or the old Northwest, which we would now call our Midwest. The creation of a national market economy and regional specializations. We know kind of the West is the breadbasket, the Northeast is the center of industry, and the South for cotton production, which fed the textile mills in the Northeast. We'll also see increased immigration during the market revolution, particularly Irish and German immigrants, and we'll see a westward movement, which we'll discuss, and finally the growth of cities, or urbanization. So I want to talk about the first Industrial Revolution, and this was one of those memory tools we talked about. The first and second Industrial Revolutions would be trick rows, but the trick stands for textiles, railroads, iron, and coal, and it's where we see most of our changes. The growth of the textile mills, particularly in New England and the Northeast, the building of railroads throughout the nation to connect the nation, the use of iron and the use of coal to power up in the factories as well. And so, of course, this really wouldn't be possible without new inventions and innovations, which really stimulated the economic growth. If you remember, Samuel Slater's the father of the factory system. He built the first efficient cotton spinning machine in America, the spinning jenny, and Rhode Island, the first textile mill was formed. This was back in the 1790s as well. By 1792, we see, or 1793, I'm sorry, we see the invention of the cotton gin, 50 times more effective than picking cotton by hand. It's going to drastically change the United States. For example, before the cotton gin, hand-picking 1 pound of cotton took a slave an entire day. Um, Yet cotton production afterwards becomes, this was 50 times more effective, and, King Cotton emerges in the South. Slavery, what, so many had considered to be a dying institution, was revived and saw a dramatic increase. And we'll see that we talked about previously, the westward expansion to Alabama and Mississippi occurred due to increased demand for land because of increased demand for cotton to feed those New England textile mills. We'll also see the invention of the steam engine, which is going to, of course, lead to both steamships, which will be able to navigate rivers uh, upstream as well as downstream, and the railroads, which will be probably the most significant transportation innovation during this time period. Interchangeable parts were introduced in 1798, widely adopted by 1850s, and essentially the basis of modern mass production, these assembly line methods as well. And finally, communication, the telegraph by Samuel Morse. In 1844, he built the 40-mile line connecting D.C. and Baltimore. And the U.S. government didn't control it. They felt they would not pay, but eventually, it did provide instant communication across large distances. And this significantly influenced business throughout the following decades until the later part, we see the invention of the telephone in the 1870s, I believe. And finally, the Lowell system. This textile industry really sparked, and especially during the War of 1812, when it was forced, when essentially New England was forced to be more self-sufficient. And in 1814, Francis Cabot Lowell built the first dual-purpose textile plant in Waltham, Massachusetts, and his factory spun the fiber, wove the finished cloth, and work moved from really what we call this cottage industry in the homes to the factory. And we'll see this as well. The Lowell girls were local farmers' daughters, were hired to work in the factories, and the jobs provided the lure of more independence for these young women. Lowell promised strict moral supervision. Remember, we're still in New England, and mandatory church attendance for the Lowell girls. And by 1836, we see this playing out. By the 1830s, we see this playing out. Eventually, water power and steam power will replace female labor, and Irish and German immigrants eventually will replace the Lowell girls. They were somewhat less troublesome. They would work for very low wages, especially the Irish immigrants as well. Going on to the geography of industrialization, we all know it was the Northeast, particularly New England. And, why New England? And for the most part, keep in mind that rocky soil in New England really discouraged cash crop farming. It just was not as fertile as the West or the South. Therefore, manufacturing was just simply more attractive. Furthermore, there were good seaports, which made for easy imports and exports, and rapid rivers provided water power for the running factory machines. Another big question, why not the South? And we've been talking about this sectionalism, and keep in mind that for the most part, resources in the South capital was tied up in slaves. Cotton came to rule the South, except for Virginia, which was tobacco, and local consumers really couldn't afford most finished products. Keep in mind the South was this almost aristocratic social setting, which we'll talk about in later reviews. Do keep in mind, though, by 1850, industrial output exceeded agricultural output, and we're going to see this first industrial revolution really lead to this new industrial nation. We're not quite caught up with Britain yet, but by the turn of the century, by the 1900, Britain, the United States, and Germany are the top 3 industrial producers in the world. Central to this was also the transportation revolution, and one of the prime motives really was to connect the East to the West. The West had all these resources, but you had the Appalachian Mountains that were separating the two. And ultimately, what we're going to see is a national market economy that is going to create this regional specialization, bring it together. And transportation conditions prior to the transportation revolution were very poor. Roads were bad throughout much of the year. They could be very dusty in the summer, muddy during the rainy season. I think we talked about this during the whiskey revolt. It was just cheaper for farmers in western Pennsylvania to make whiskey than it was to ship corn. And it cost more to haul a ton of goods 9 miles inland than to transport it from Europe, just because the roads were so bad. Also, rivers ran mostly north and south. East-west travel was often impossible for freight. However, the construction of roads and turnpikes will help to change this. In 1790, the first one, the Lancaster Turnpike in Pennsylvania, was built by a private company, became highly profitable. And keep in mind what I'm saying, even with the American system, what Henry Clay envisioned, roads being built by the federal government never really happened. Rather, they were either private companies or state funded projects, roads, canals, and all of that. There were tolls on these roads, and but the Lancaster Turnpike touched off a turnpike building boom, and by 1832 the United States had nearly 2,400 miles of roads connecting most major cities, including the Cumberland Road, which became the National Road, which linked Cumberland and Western Maryland to Illinois, a 591-mile road that was supported by state funds and a little bit of federal funds even as well, became this vital highway to the west. Steamboats was just another incredible innovation during this time period that greatly changed the markets. The steam engine by Robert Fulton went 500 miles up the Hudson River to Albany, and only 32, I'm sorry, not 500 miles, went up the Hudson River to Albany in a short period of time. But this is going to change all of America's navigable streams into two-way arteries. The carrying capacity of rivers is essentially going to double as a result. And we'll see population of people clustered along banks of rivers, and especially the Mississippi, and moving that produce will connect the West even more with the East. Contributing with the use of the steamboats were the canals, and the Erie Canal, of course, is the most important canal during this time period. And this was a New York, financed by New York. And what we'll see as a result of the Erie Canal, shipping time is really reduced from western New York to eastern New York to from 20 days to 6. Land values, of course, are going to skyrocket. This is where we'll see new cities such as Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse. But more importantly, it's going to lead to an explosion of towns on the Great Lakes, Cleveland, Detroit, and later even Chicago as well. There were other canals, of course, that were built connecting the Great Lakes with other major rivers and cities. The Erie Canal by far the most significant. And the most significant aspect of the transportation revolution, of course, were the railroads. It was fast, reliable, cheaper than canals to construct, all-weather transportation through nearly all terrain. And by 1860, 30,000 miles of railroad track was laid. Do keep in mind it was disproportionate in the nation. About 75% of that railroad track was in the Northeast. As a result of all of this, by the Civil War, a national market economy essentially emerges. Each specializing in certain areas. The South, of course, was not as linked as other regions, which is going to contribute later on to a certain isolation felt by Southerners prior to the Civil War. Another important objective to discuss are the changes that were caused by the market revolution had significant effects on U.S. society, on workers' life, and on gender and family relations. I want to discuss next the growth of the working class. The Industrial Revolution had really transformed working conditions, and especially as more and more people are migrating into cities, we're going to see some changes. First off, working conditions were definitely not ideal. Working conditions in factories were often oppressive. There were long hours, low wages, few breaks, poor ventilation, poor lighting. Workers were forbidden by law to form unions until later on, I think right before the Civil War. And the use of women and children was excessive. Women and children typically worked 6 days a week for extremely low wages. Lowell farm girls were supervised on and off the job, and probably about by 1820, about half of the nation's industrial workers were under the age of 10. Many suffered devastating effects from abuse. Yet, throughout the 1830s and 40s, we're going to begin to see gains for some workers prior to the Civil War. During the age of Jackson, as we see the increase of mass democracy, many states are going to grant voting rights to working men. And as a result, we're going to see working men lobby to form parties, come together. Laborers are going to seek a 10-hour workday, higher wages, more, better working conditions. And by 1840, President Van Buren actually establishes a 10-hour workday for federal employees on public works, with several states then following suit by reducing work hours. We'll also see, the Massachusetts Supreme Court in a decision Commonwealth versus Hunt decide that labor unions were legal so long as they were not violent or subversive. While this was not really immediately significant and was more symbolic, it did kind of lay the path for better working conditions for the working class. We'll also see during this time period the development of the middle class, which was still very much a minority and mostly in the Northeast. This included businessmen, shopkeepers, doctors, lawyers, and we're going to see a very increased standard of living. Do keep in mind, though, there's going to be both an upper and lower middle class. The upper middle class will be very affluent lifestyles. The lower middle class, mostly salaried clerks and managers who really had hoped hard work and thrift would be rewarded with upward mobility. Education, sobriety, and religious affiliation were important indicators of middle class status. A comfortable home was essential. And so we're going to see the emergence of the cult of domesticity, that women should be pious and raise well-behaved children. And this ideal of separate spheres will, become the ideal, that men should occupy the social public sphere and women belong to the domestic private sphere. As factories are being built and there's more movement, the home was no longer the center of economic production, and rather, especially for the middle class, it grew into a refuge from the world of work that became this separate sphere for women. But we do see the foundations for this cult of domesticity, women's role in the home, women's role as mother, kind of a continuation of this the Republican motherhood of the earlier time period, but more emphasis on having a nice home. We're also going to see large numbers of international migrants move to industrializing northern cities. As many Americans are moving west, there's a lot of movement going on. And so I want to discuss first and the settlement patterns with them. So, the Irish and German immigrants in the early 1800s are going to increase in huge numbers. And, as far as the German immigrants, probably about 1.5 million between 1830 and 1860 came over. By 1900, they were the largest immigrant group in the United States. And even today, over 20% of Americans have German ancestry. Most were uprooted farmers, many were displaced by crop failures. And many of the Germans were able to move to the Midwest, for example, Wisconsin, where they built successful farms. They were generally better educated than existing frontier Americans. They supported schools. The idea of the German kindergarten or children's garden grew. And Germans were kind of mixed religiously. Some were Protestant, some were Catholic. And beer became very important to the German culture, which contributed to the growth of the temperance movement. As far as Irish immigrants, they struggled a bit more than the German immigrants. First of all, the majority of Irish immigrants began coming over in the mid-1840s because of the potato famine, which left about 2 million people dead in Ireland. And 2 million Irish immigrants arrived in the United States between 1830 and 1860. More Irish people lived in the U.S. than in Ireland. They came to the larger cities. They couldn't afford to move out west. And because of this, we'll see increased, very poor Irish, increased slums in the cities, and Boston and New York are going to contain more Irish than anywhere else in the world. The Irish very much became targets for discrimination. They were Catholic, they were poor, they were often hated by native Protestants, as the Irish took over jobs for very low wages, they competed with African Americans for these lowest jobs. Therefore, we'll see a lot of racism um, and hatred between these two groups. There were race riots between dock workers in certain port cities. And during the abolitionist movements, the Irish did not support abolitionism as it would adversely affect them. The Irish did climb up the social ladder by buying some property as a group, and they became very politically involved in the political machines. New York City's Tammany Hall, which dominated New York politics and machine politics, will dominate as well. And the Irish in New York and Boston become very influential in the police departments, kind of the rewards of the spoil system and them as well. Politicians also courted the Irish vote by criticizing Britain, whom the Irish hated. And so we'll see the Irish, despite being poor, become a major force in the Democratic Party in the North. Because of the number of immigrants, we're also going to see a strongly anti-Catholic nativist movement arise, aimed at limiting new immigrants' political power and cultural influence. Keep in mind, nativists had a certain hatred and fear of foreigners. Irish and German immigration offended many Protestant nativists. They feared that immigrants would overpopulate, unduly influence. The Irish and a large minority of Germans were Catholic. This was viewed as, popery, and the extreme nativists later on formed the Know Nothing Party. They hated the drinking patterns of the Irish and Germans. They didn't like the religion of them, and they're going to seek restrictions on immigration and naturalizations. We'll even see some episodes of violence. And the Know Nothing in the 1850s actually became extremely influential, although they're on the verge of replacing the Whigs as a second major party, although eventually they did die out. And finally, we're also going to see settlement patterns move west along the Ohio and Mississippi River Valley, something we talked about earlier. The Ohio Valley, areas of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois in particular, become the breadbasket of the U.S. And most produce was sent down the Mississippi River to feed the southern slave states. Corn was used to make liquor and also food for pigs. And the South, of course, became known for cotton export as well. And with this cotton for export in the South really resisted change to its economy. There was very little industrial growth, and even some of that, there was an ironworks company in Virginia that used slave labor. And despite the interdependence of southern cotton with northern industry, the East and the West become much more economically interconnected. And during this, prior to the Civil War, the South begins to feel very isolated, leading to tensions that will arise later on. Finally, as I was saying, this increasing southern cotton production and the related growth of northern manufacturing, baking, and shipping promoted the development of national and international commercial ties. In many ways, and we'll talk about sectionalism in the next unit, the fact that Southerners resented their reliance upon northern bankers, upon northern textile mills. But we do see this interdependence really of the whole nation. Our next review will talk about Jacksonian democracy and the increase in universal white male suffrage.